The rain hammered against the tin roof of the makeshift field hospital in Okinawa. April 1945. The war was ending, but nobody told the dying. The smell of antiseptic mixed with blood and mud created a nauseating cocktail that Private Thomas Mitchell would never forget, no matter how hard he tried. He stood guard outside a tent holding Japanese prisoners, his rifle heavy in his hands, heavier than it had ever been during training back in Camp Pendleton. Tom was just 22 years old, fresh-faced despite the dirt and exhaustion etched into every line of his young face. His hands shook, not from cold, though the April rain had turned the Okinawan spring into something bitter and unforgiving, but from everything he had seen in the past 3 months since landing on this godforsaken island. Bodies. So many bodies. American boys he had trained with, laughed with, shared cigarettes with, now lying in rows covered with tarps. Japanese soldiers, some no older than 15, their faces frozen in final moments of terror or defiance. Civilians caught in the crossfire, old men and women and children who had nowhere to run when two empires decided to destroy each other on their homeland. War didn't discriminate. It took everyone. Inside that tent, separated from Tom by nothing but canvas and the arbitrary lines drawn by nations, a woman lay dying. The medics, exhausted men who had stopped sleeping days ago, said she had maybe hours left, a day at most if she was unlucky. Shrapnel wounds from American artillery had torn through her abdomen and left leg. Infection was spreading like wildfire through her frail body, turning her skin hot and her eyes glassy with fever. She was maybe 30 years old, maybe younger. War aged people in ways time never could, stealing youth and replacing it with hollowness. Her name was Akiko Tanaka, though Tom wouldn't learn that for another 2 weeks. To him, to everyone in the camp, she was just prisoner 273, a number in a ledger, an enemy combatant who happened to be female and happened to be dying and wasn't supposed to matter at all. Tom wasn't supposed to care. The enemy was the enemy. That's what they told him in boot camp, shouting it until the words became rhythm, became heartbeat, became truth. That's what Captain Richard Yamamoto, a Japanese-American officer from California who had more to prove than anyone, reminded him every single day. Keep your distance. Don't fraternize. Don't think of them as people because people are harder to fight, harder to kill, harder to watch die. But when Tom looked through the tent flap during his guard shift that first night, when he saw her clutching a photograph to her chest even in her delirium, even as fever dreams made her cry out in Japanese words he couldn't understand, something inside him broke. Or maybe, something inside him finally started to heal. The photograph showed two small children, a boy and a girl, maybe 5 and 7 years old, smiling in front of a cherry blossom tree. Their mother's arms were around them, frozen in a moment of happiness that felt like it belonged to a different universe than this tent, this island, this war. Tom made a decision that night that would haunt him for 80 years. Not haunt in the way his other war memories did, with blood and screaming and the face of the first man he killed. This was different. This haunting was quieter, more persistent, a question that would follow him through 8 decades of life. Did I do enough? Did it matter? Did she survive? He decided to steal medical supplies. It wasn't a dramatic decision, wasn't accompanied by violins or moral clarity or any sense that he was doing something heroic. It was simple and stupid and dangerous. The medical tent was guarded but not well, because who would steal from their own side? Who would risk court-martial for the enemy? Tom would. Tom did. That first night he took sulfa drugs, the miracle powder that fought infection. He took clean bandages, morphine for the pain, a canteen of clean water. He stuffed everything inside his jacket and walked back to his post with his heart hammering so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He snuck into the prisoner tent at 0200 hours during the shift change when the guards were distracted, and the camp was as quiet as a battlefield ever got. Akiko was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rattling. Tom had seen enough death to recognize its approach. He had maybe one night, maybe less. He cleaned her wounds with water he had boiled on a contraband camping stove, using techniques he had watched the medics perform 100 times. He sprinkled sulfa powder into the infected tissue, watching her face contort with pain even in unconsciousness. He wrapped clean bandages around her abdomen and leg, his hands steadier than they had any right to be. He gave her a small dose of morphine, not enough to kill, but enough to ease the suffering. Then he did something he would never be able to explain, not to himself, not to anyone. He took her hand and whispered that she would survive, that she would see her children again. that this wasn't the end. He didn't speak Japanese. She didn't speak English. She probably couldn't hear him anyway. But he said it because he needed to believe it was true. Because if she could survive, then maybe there was still some good left in the world. Maybe he wasn't completely lost. He came back the next night. And the next. And the next. For 2 weeks, Tom Mitchell lived a double life. During the day, he was a model soldier, following orders, cleaning his rifle, writing cheerful lies to his mother back in Pennsylvania about how the war was almost over and he would be home soon. At night, he became something else. A thief, a traitor according to military law, a human being according to something deeper than law. He watched Akiko slowly, impossibly, begin to heal. The fever broke on the 4th night. She regained consciousness on the 6th, her eyes opening to find an American soldier changing her bandages, and the terror in those eyes nearly made Tom stop, nearly made him realize how insane this all was. But he kept coming back. He started bringing food, small portions stolen from his own rations, rice, canned peaches, once, impossibly, chocolate. She began to recognize him, to wait for him. They couldn't communicate with words, but they developed a language of gestures and expressions. She would point to the photograph and then to her heart. He would nod and point to the camp exit, trying to convey that she would leave, that she would go home. She would place her hand over his when he changed her bandages, a gesture of gratitude that transcended every border and battle line. Captain Richard Yamamoto caught him on the 14th night. Tom was so focused on cleaning Akiko's wounds that he didn't hear the footsteps, didn't see the tent flap open until it was too late. He looked up to find his commanding officer staring at him, and in that moment, Tom knew his life was over. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe prison. He had violated direct orders, stolen military supplies, fraternized with the enemy. The book would be thrown at him, and the book was heavy. Tom stood slowly, his hands raised, waiting for the shouting to begin, but Captain Yamamoto didn't shout. He looked at Tom for a long moment, then looked at Akiko, who had pulled the thin blanket up to her chin in fear, her eyes darting between the 2 American soldiers. The captain's face was unreadable, carved from stone. Then he did something Tom never expected. He walked over to Akiko, checked her wounds with the practiced eye of someone who had seen too much suffering, and nodded once. He turned to Tom and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "She'll live. You did good work, Private." Then he walked out of the tent without another word, leaving Tom standing there in shock, his entire world reoriented in the space of 30 seconds. They never spoke about it directly. Captain Yamamoto never filed a report, never mentioned the incident, never acknowledged what he had witnessed. But the next night, Tom found extra medical supplies in his footlocker, carefully wrapped and unmarked. The night after that, the guard schedule was adjusted so Tom's shift always coincided with the quietest hours. Some rules of war, Tom learned, were made to be broken by people who remembered that rules were written by men, not gods, and men could be wrong. Some officers understood that following orders wasn't the same as doing what was right. Captain Yamamoto was one of those officers, a man caught between his duty to his country and his understanding that the enemy prisoners were human beings, that they deserved basic dignity, even in defeat. Years later, Tom would learn that the captain had family in the Japanese internment camps back in California, that he fought for America while his parents were imprisoned by America. That moral complexity was something he lived every single day. Maybe that's why he walked away. Maybe that's why he helped. Maybe that's why he understood. Akiko Tanaka survived. By the 3rd week she could sit up. By the 4th she could walk with assistance. By the time the war ended on August 15, 1945, she was healthy enough to be repatriated, one of tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners who returned home to a country that had been bombed into submission, that had seen 2 cities vaporized by atomic fire, that had surrendered for the first time in its history. Tom watched her leave from a distance, standing with the other soldiers as trucks carried prisoners to the docks. He saw her turn and scan the crowd, saw her eyes find his across 50 yards of mud and wire and history. She bowed deeply, a gesture of respect and gratitude that made his throat tight. He raised his hand in a small wave, inadequate and perfect. Then she was gone, disappeared into the chaos of war's end, and Tom was left with nothing but memories and questions. Did she make it back to her children? Did she tell them about the American soldier? Did his decision matter at all? He would carry those questions for 80 years. Tom came home to Pennsylvania in December 1945. on a troop ship crowded with men who had survived but weren't sure they had won anything worth winning. The voyage took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of staring at the ocean and trying to forget what solid ground had looked like covered in blood. They landed in San Francisco to crowds and confetti and brass bands playing songs about heroes and glory. Everyone called him a hero. There were parades down Main Street in his hometown of Harrisburg, medals pinned to his chest by men in suits who had never heard a gunshot in anger, handshakes from strangers who had no idea what he had actually done over there, what he had seen, what he had become. They thanked him for his service with bright smiles and empty eyes. He smiled back and said it was his duty and felt like a fraud. Because heroes were supposed to feel proud, supposed to feel like they had accomplished something. Tom just felt tired and old and haunted by faces that wouldn't fade, no matter how much he drank or how little he slept. He married his sweetheart Margaret Callahan in June 1947, a beautiful ceremony in the Presbyterian church where they had both been baptized. She wore her mother's wedding dress. He wore his uniform because it was expected, because that's what returning soldiers did. They honeymooned in Niagara Falls, and he had nightmares every night, waking up screaming about artillery fire, and Margaret held him without asking questions because she understood that some things couldn't be spoken. They had 3 children. Emily was born in 1948, Robert in 1951, James in 1954. Tom worked at the Bethlehem steel mill for 40 years, starting as a floor worker and eventually becoming a shift supervisor. He came home every evening at 6 o'clock, washed the industrial grime from his hands, ate dinner with his family, read the newspaper, watched Walter Cronkite deliver the news in measured tones. He coached Little League on weekends. He went to church on Sundays. He voted in every election. He paid his taxes. He mowed his lawn. A normal life, an American life, the kind of life he had fought for, the kind of life that was supposed to make everything worth it. But the nightmares never stopped. They evolved, changed shape, but never disappeared. Some nights he was back in Okinawa, watching boys he knew die in ways that violated every natural law. Some nights he was in the prisoner tent, but when he looked down, the woman wasn't Akiko, she was Margaret, or Emily, or his mother, and he couldn't save any of them. Some nights he was being court-martialed, dragged in front of a tribunal and accused of treason while Akiko's corpse was wheeled in as evidence. He woke up gasping, sweating, Margaret's hand on his shoulder, her voice soft and worried. Just a dream, Tom, just a dream. But they weren't dreams. They were memories wearing different masks. The faces never faded, the weight never lifted, and he never, not once in 50 years, told anyone about Akiko Tanaka. Not Margaret, not his children, not the therapist the VA assigned him in 1978 when he finally admitted he might need help. Some memories are too heavy to share. Some decisions are too complicated to explain. How do you tell people that you saved an enemy soldier while your friends were dying? How do you explain that you felt more human in that tent, committing what technically was treason, than you ever felt following orders? How do you say that you think about her more than you think about the battles you won, the medals you earned, the war you survived? Margaret died in October 2018, 3 weeks after their 71st anniversary. Pneumonia, the doctor said, though Tom knew it was really just age and exhaustion and the cumulative weight of 7 decades of living. She slipped away quietly in the hospital, holding his hand, and Tom felt something inside him break that had been cracked for years. She had been his anchor, his interpreter for a world that had stopped making sense somewhere between Okinawa and home. Without her, he was adrift. Emily convinced him to move in with her family in suburban Philadelphia. She had a big house, a guest room with its own bathroom, grandchildren who could benefit from having their grandfather around. Tom agreed because he didn't have the energy to argue, because the house in Harrisburg held too many ghosts, because he was 83 years old and tired of being alone. He spent his days in Emily's garden, growing tomatoes and cucumbers, and remembering a world that no longer existed. His grandchildren, Emma and Lucas, asked him about the war sometimes, the way children do, with innocent curiosity and no understanding of what they were really asking. He told them sanitized stories, the kind you tell children. He talked about the ship voyage, about eating K-rations, about seeing the ocean for the first time. He showed them his medals and explained what each one meant in terms that avoided words like kill and die and horror. He never told them about the woman in the tent. He never told them about stealing supplies and risking court-martial. He never told them about the choice that defined his entire life, the 2 weeks that mattered more than 4 years of war. Some stories aren't for children. Some stories aren't for anyone. Emily found the letters in March 2025, 3 months before her father's 80th birthday. She was cleaning out boxes in the attic, a project she had been putting off for years, looking for old photographs for the birthday party she was planning. Tom was turning 80 and Emily wanted to make it special, wanted to gather everyone together and celebrate a man who had lived quietly and decently and deserved recognition. She was digging through boxes of Christmas decorations, old tax returns, her children's elementary school artwork, when she discovered a small metal tin hidden beneath a layer of tinsel and dust. It was an old ammunition box, military issue, the kind soldiers used to store personal items during the war. Inside were letters, dozens of them, maybe 50, maybe more, all addressed to Private Thomas Mitchell, U.S. Army, with an APO address that hadn't existed since 1946, all from Japan, all written in careful, halting English that improved over the decades, all signed Akiko Tanaka. Emily sat on the attic floor, dust motes dancing in the light from the single bare bulb, and read them all. It took hours. She missed dinner. She ignored her phone. She couldn't stop. The first letter was dated March 1952, 7 years after the war ended. 7 years of searching, Akiko explained in her careful script. 7 years of writing to the U.S. military, to veterans organizations, to anyone who might know the name of a young private who had been stationed in Okinawa in 1945. 7 years of hitting dead ends and being told that soldiers were returned home and scattered across America like seeds. Impossible to track. But she had finally found an address, forwarded through 3 different agencies, and she was writing to say thank you. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for seeing me as human when I was supposed to be the enemy. Thank you for giving me back my future. She described how she had returned to her village in Kyushu in September 1945, traveling by train through a Japan that had been bombed into rubble, past cities that were just ash and memory. She described finding her home partially destroyed but still standing, a miracle in a country of ruins. She described the moment she saw her children, Yuki and Hiroshi, now 8 and 10 years old, raised by her sister Keiko, after Akiko had been conscripted into war work and then captured. She described how they didn't recognize her at first, how she had lost so much weight and aged so much that her own children looked at her like a stranger. She described holding them and crying and promising never to leave again. She described rebuilding her life from ashes and grief, working in the rice fields, remarrying a kind man who had also lost everything, slowly finding joy again in a world that had tried its best to destroy all joy. The letters came every year after that, sometimes twice a year. Akiko told Tom about her children growing up in a new Japan, a Japan occupied by Americans but not destroyed by them, a Japan that was learning democracy and rebuilding and finding its place in a world that had changed forever. She told him about Yuki becoming a teacher, about Hiroshi studying engineering. She told him about Japan's transformation from military empire to economic power, about bullet trains and electronics, and a peace that felt fragile but real. She told him about her own journey from hatred to understanding, about how she had spent years after the war hating Americans for what they had done to her country, for the bombs and the occupation and the humiliation. But she couldn't hate Tom. She couldn't hate the man who had saved her life when he had every reason to let her die. And if she couldn't hate him, maybe she couldn't hate all Americans. Maybe hate was a choice, just like kindness was a choice. Maybe the world could be different if more people chose differently. She told him about her nightmares too, about waking up in the prisoner tent thinking she was dying, about the terror of capture and the certainty that Americans would torture her or kill her or worse. She told him about the propaganda they had been fed, about how they were told Americans were demons who would show no mercy. She told him how wrong that propaganda was, how Tom had shown her more mercy than she had any right to expect. She told him she forgave him for being American. She told him she forgave herself for surviving when so many didn't, for being captured instead of fighting to the death like the propaganda said she should. She told him she prayed for him every day, in the small Buddhist shrine in her home, lighting incense and asking whatever gods were listening to keep him safe, to give him peace, to let him know that his choice mattered. Tom had never responded, not once, not to a single letter in 50 years. Emily found drafts of letters he had started and never finished, crumpled papers covered in crossed-out words and ink stains that might have been tears or might have been whiskey. She smoothed them out and read his attempts to find words for something beyond words. Dear Akiko, I don't know what to say. Dear Akiko, I'm glad you survived. Dear Akiko, I think about you. Dear Akiko, I'm sorry. Dear Akiko, I'm not a hero. Dear Akiko, I don't deserve your gratitude. Dear Akiko, I don't know how to carry this. None of the drafts were more than a few sentences. None of them were enough. He couldn't find the words. Or maybe he found too many. Maybe the weight of 80 years was too heavy to fit into a letter. Maybe he was afraid that responding would make it real, would force him to confront what he had done and why and what it meant. Maybe he was just a coward. Emily thought that was probably it. Her father, the war hero, was too afraid to face his own humanity. The last letter was dated November 2023, just 18 months ago. Akiko was 78 years old. Her handwriting was shakier but still careful, still precise. She wrote that her husband had died 2 years earlier, that she was living with her son Kenji in Tokyo, that her health was failing, but her mind was still sharp. She wrote that she was coming to America in the summer of 2025 to visit Kenji, who had moved to Philadelphia for work, something about international business that she didn't fully understand but was proud of anyway. She wrote that she hoped, somehow, to find Tom Mitchell. She had his last known address from the 1950s, somewhere in Pennsylvania. She knew it was a long shot. She knew 80 years was a lifetime, that he might be dead, that he might not want to see her, but she needed to try. She needed to thank him face to face before she died. She needed to tell him that he had given her 53 years with her children, that she had watched them grow and marry and have children of their own, that she had held great-grandchildren in her arms. She needed him to know that his decision in that tent in 1945 had created 47 lives, 47 people who existed because he chose compassion over cruelty. She needed him to understand that he was her hero, not because he was a soldier, but because he was human. She left an address in Philadelphia, Kenji's apartment in Center City. She said, if you get this letter, if you're still alive, if you remember me at all, please come. Please let me say thank you. Please let me give you peace. Emily stared at that address for a long time, sitting on the attic floor with decades of letters spread around her like fallen leaves. Her father had carried this secret for 80 years. Her father had saved a woman's life and never told anyone. Her father had received letters for 50 years and never responded. Her father was haunted by something beautiful, and he had borne it alone. Emily felt anger and sadness and overwhelming love for this complicated man, who had raised her, who had coached her softball team and walked her down the aisle and held her babies, and never once mentioned that he was a hero in the truest sense of the word. She made a decision then, sitting in that attic surrounded by her father's secret. She pulled out her phone and called the number written on the last letter. A man answered in accented English. "This is Kenji Tanaka." Emily took a deep breath and said, "My name is Emily Mitchell. I think you've been looking for my father." The next 3 months were a whirlwind of planning. Emily told Kenji the whole story, or as much as she understood from the letters. Kenji told her about his mother, about how she had talked about the American soldier her entire life, about how finding Tom had become her life's mission. They agreed not to tell Tom. It would be a surprise, a gift for his 80th birthday. Emily wasn't sure if it was a good idea, wasn't sure if the shock might be too much for an 80-year-old man with a weak heart, but Kenji said his mother needed this, had waited 80 years for this, and Emily thought about her father's nightmares and decided that maybe he needed it too. Maybe they both needed to close a circle that had been open for 8 decades. June 14th, 2025, Tom's 80th birthday. The backyard of Emily's house in suburban Philadelphia was transformed into a party venue. White tents, tables covered in checkered cloth, balloons tied to every available surface. 3 generations of Mitchells filled the space, laughing and eating cake and celebrating a man who had lived a quiet, decent life. Tom sat in his favorite chair, a weathered Adirondack that Emily had dragged from the garage, overwhelmed by the noise and love and sheer number of people who had come to celebrate him turning 80. His son Robert had flown in from Oregon with his family. His son James had driven up from Virginia. There were grandchildren and great-grandchildren, cousins he hadn't seen in years, old friends from the steel mill, neighbors who had known him for decades. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, to tell him happy birthday, to share a memory of Tom being kind or helpful or just present. He felt like a fraud. He felt ancient. He felt grateful and confused and wondering how he got so old so fast, how the young private in Okinawa had turned into this weathered man with liver spots and arthritis and memories that weighed more than his body. Emily stood up and clinked her glass with a fork. the sharp sound cutting through the party noise. The backyard fell quiet. She gave a speech about her father, about his strength and kindness and the sacrifices his generation made so hers could grow up in peace and prosperity. She talked about him working at the steel mill for 40 years, about him coaching Little League and volunteering at the church and being a rock for his family. She talked about how he had served his country with honor, how he had earned medals and respect, and had never once bragged about any of it. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair, hating being the center of attention, wishing everyone would just eat cake and leave him alone. Then Emily said something that made his blood run cold. She said there was someone special who wanted to meet him, someone who had traveled very far, someone who had been looking for him for 80 years, someone who owed him everything. Tom's heart stopped. He knew. Somehow, impossibly he knew. His hands gripped the arms of the chair so hard his knuckles turned white. His breath came short and fast. Emily was still talking, but he couldn't hear her over the roaring in his ears. The back gate opened, the one that led from the driveway to the yard. An elderly Japanese woman walked through, supported by a younger man who had to be her son. She was small and frail, her hair white as snow, her body bent by age and gravity, but her eyes were sharp and clear and full of purpose. She wore a simple blue dress and carried a photograph in her hands, clutched to her chest like a talisman. Tom recognized that photograph even from 30 feet away. 2 small children in front of a cherry blossom tree. The same photograph he had seen clutched in dying fingers 80 years ago. Time stopped. The backyard noise faded to nothing, voices becoming distant and dreamlike. The world narrowed to just 2 people, 2 survivors, 2 people who had been bound together by a choice made in a tent in 1945 and had carried that choice through 8 decades of life. Tom tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work. They shook and failed, and he collapsed back into the chair. He tried to speak, but no words came, just a strangled sound that might have been her name or might have been a sob. Akiko walked toward him slowly, each step deliberate, each step carrying 80 years of gratitude and grief and grace. Kenji stayed close, ready to catch her if she fell, but she didn't need his help. She was strong in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. When she reached Tom, she did something that made everyone in the backyard gasp. She knelt down, this 78-year-old woman lowering herself to the ground in front of him, her knees hitting the grass with a soft thud. It was a gesture of profound respect, the kind reserved for emperors and gods, and she was giving it to a retired steelworker from Pennsylvania. She took his hands in hers. Her hands were small and weathered, marked by decades of labor and life. His hands were large and scarred, marked by war and work. They fit together perfectly. She spoke in English, each word carefully chosen, each word carrying the weight of 50 years of letters he had never answered. Thank you. Her voice was soft but clear. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for seeing me when I was supposed to be invisible. Thank you for choosing humanity when the world chose hate. Because of you, I lived. Because of you, my children had a mother. Because of you, I learned that even in the darkest war, there is light. Because of you, I learned that one person can make a difference. Because of you, I learned that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that compassion is braver than hate. Because of you, I had 53 years I wasn't supposed to have. Because of you, I lived. Tom collapsed. Not physically, though his body shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep and ancient. He collapsed emotionally, spiritually. All the walls he had built for 80 years crumbling in an instant like they were made of paper instead of stone. He cried for the boy he was, 22 years old and terrified, and trying to do the right thing in a world that had stopped making sense. He cried for all the people he couldn't save, all the bodies he had stepped over, all the faces that haunted his dreams. He cried for Captain Yamamoto, who had died in a car accident in 1987 without Tom ever thanking him. He cried for Margaret, who had held him through nightmares for 70 years without ever knowing why. He cried for the weight he had carried alone for so long, the question that had followed him through 8 decades. Did it matter? Did she survive? Did I do enough? And he cried because she was alive, because his decision mattered, because kindness won, because sometimes the story has a happy ending, even when you're sure it doesn't. Akiko held him while he broke apart and put himself back together. She didn't try to stop his tears or comfort him with empty words. She just held his hands and let him grieve for everything he had lost and everything he had saved. The backyard was silent except for his weeping. Even the children understood they were witnessing something sacred, something that transcended birthday parties and cake and normal life. Emily cried. Kenji cried. Robert and James cried. The grandchildren cried. Everyone cried because sometimes tears are the only language big enough for the moment. After a long time, maybe minutes, maybe hours, Tom finally found his voice. It came out cracked and broken, barely more than a whisper. Did you find your children? The question that had haunted him for 80 years finally spoken aloud. Akiko smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds after a storm that had lasted a lifetime. She said, "They are here." Two elderly people stepped forward from the crowd, where they had been standing quietly, waiting. A man and a woman in their late 70s, elegant and dignified. Yuki and Hiroshi, the children from the photograph, now grandparents themselves. They had flown from Tokyo for this moment, had traveled across the Pacific to meet the man who had saved their mother's life, who had given them back their future. They bowed deeply to Tom, a formal bow that spoke of respect and gratitude beyond words. They spoke in careful English, better than their mothers. "Our mother told us about you our entire lives. We grew up hearing about the American soldier who saved her. We grew up knowing that we existed because of your choice. You are the reason we are here. You are the reason our children are here. You are the reason our grandchildren are here. We named our sons after you, Thomas Tanaka, Tom Mitchell Yamada. Your name lives in our family. Your choice echoes through generations. Thank you is not enough, but it is all we have. Thank you for giving us our mother. Thank you for giving us our lives." Tom looked at these people, these lives that continued because of one decision made in a tent in Okinawa 80 years ago. He looked at their children standing behind them, middle-aged adults with kind faces. He looked at their grandchildren, teenagers, and young adults who had flown halfway around the world to meet a man they had only heard about in stories. He saw the ripples of his choice spreading out like water, touching generations he would never meet, creating lives he would never know. 47 people, Akiko had written in her letter. 47 lives. Tom counted them now, standing in his daughter's backyard, and the number was real and overwhelming and impossible. 47 people who existed because he stole medical supplies and risked court-martial and chose to see a dying woman as human instead of enemy. He understood finally that one act of humanity can echo through time in ways we can never predict or control. He understood that his life had mattered. He understood that he had been enough. They talked for hours. The party continued around them, but Tom and Akiko sat together in their own bubble of time, filling in 80 years of silence. Kenji translated when needed, though often translation wasn't necessary. Some things transcend language. She told him about rebuilding Japan, about the hard years after the war when food was scarce and hope was scarcer. She told him about the American occupation, about how she had been terrified at first, expecting cruelty, but instead found soldiers who gave her children chocolate and helped rebuild schools. She told him about the hungry years in the 1950s, about working in factories to support her family, about her hands bleeding from assembly line work. She told him about the miracle years of the 1960s and 70s, about Japan's transformation into an economic power, about watching her country rise from ashes. She told him about the years when she wanted to give up, when the weight of survival felt heavier than death would have been, but she didn't give up because he had given her a reason to live. She told him that every time she held her children, every time she celebrated a birthday or a graduation or a wedding, she thought of him. She told him that he had been with her for 80 years even though they had never spoken. Tom told her about the nightmares, about waking up screaming for 50 years, about the faces that wouldn't fade. He told her about the guilt, about feeling like he didn't deserve to survive when so many better men had died. He told her why he could never write back to her letters, how he would start and then crumple the paper because nothing he wrote was adequate, because how do you respond to someone telling you that you saved their life? He told her he didn't feel like a hero, that heroes were supposed to be brave and strong, and he was just a terrified kid who made one decent choice in an ocean of horror. She took his hands again and told him that one decent choice was everything. She told him that heroism isn't about grand gestures or medals or parades. Heroism is about choosing humanity when the world tells you to choose hate. Heroism is about seeing the person in front of you, not the uniform or the flag or the propaganda. Heroism is about being kind when kindness costs you everything. Heroism is you, Tom Mitchell. You are my hero. As the sun set on Tom's 80th birthday, painting the Philadelphia sky in shades of orange and pink, Akiko gave him a gift. It was a journal, leather-bound and worn, water-stained and precious. She explained that she had kept a diary during her time as a prisoner, and in all the years after. She had written about her capture, about the terror and pain, about the young American soldier who saved her. She had written about her journey home, about reuniting with her children, about rebuilding her life. She had written about her search for Tom, about the dead ends and frustrations and small victories. She had the entire journal translated into English, a project that took 2 years and cost more money than she wanted to admit. She wanted him to have it. She wanted him to know her story, the whole story, the one that started in that tent in 1945 and continued through 80 years of living. Tom held the journal like it was made of glass, like it might shatter if he squeezed too hard. He promised to read every word. He promised to finally understand what his choice had meant to her. She gave him something else too, a photograph, new and crisp, printed on glossy paper. It showed Akiko surrounded by her descendants, all 47 of them, gathered in a park in Tokyo for a family reunion. 4 generations, from Yuki and Hiroshi down to great-great-grandchildren who were just babies. Everyone in the photo was holding a sign that said, "Thank you, Tom," in English and Japanese. She said, "This is your legacy. This is what you did. These 47 lives exist because you chose compassion over cruelty 80 years ago. Remember this when the nightmares come. Remember that your choice mattered. Remember that you were enough." Tom Mitchell died peacefully in his sleep on December 3, 2027, 2 years and 6 months after his 80th birthday. He was 82 years old. The nightmares had stopped after the reunion. Emily said he seemed lighter in those final 2 years, like he had finally put down a weight he had been carrying his entire life. He spent his last months reading Akiko's journal, living through her eyes, understanding finally what his choice had meant. He wrote her letters, real letters this time, and actually mailed them. They corresponded like old friends, sharing stories and memories and finding peace together. When he died, he was holding the photograph of 47 people, his legacy, his proof that one person can make a difference. At his funeral, Emily read from Akiko's journal. She read about the terror of capture, the certainty of death, and the miracle of a young American soldier who refused to let hate win. She read about Akiko's journey home, her reunion with her children, her decades of searching for the man who saved her. She read the final entry, written just days after their reunion. It said, "I have waited 80 years to say thank you. I have waited 80 years to tell him that he gave me everything. Now I can die in peace, knowing he understood that his life mattered, that his choice mattered, that he mattered." The church was packed with people whose lives Tom had touched, and in the back row sat Kenji Tanaka, representing his mother who was too frail to travel but who sent flowers and tears in gratitude. Akiko Tanaka died 4 months after Tom, in April 2028. She was 81 years old. Her family said she had been at peace since the reunion, that she had finally laid down a burden she had carried her entire life. At her funeral in Tokyo, Kenji read a letter his mother had written to be opened after her death. It was addressed to Tom, "Wherever you are now." It said, "I hope you are finally free of the nightmares. I hope you know that you were my hero, not because you were a soldier, but because you were human. I hope you remember that even in war, even in darkness, even when the world is burning, one person can make a difference. You made a difference. You saved my life. You saved my children's lives. You saved all of us. Thank you, Tom Mitchell. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for choosing love. I will find you in the next life, and thank you again." The story of Tom and Akiko spread after their deaths. A local Philadelphia newspaper picked it up first, a human interest piece about an unlikely reunion. Then national news outlets ran with it, then international media. It became a documentary on PBS, a book published by a major house, a story shared in classrooms and churches and living rooms around the world. Their families became close, visiting each other across the Pacific, building bridges that war had tried to burn. The Mitchells traveled to Japan and visited Akiko's grave, leaving flowers and tears. The Tanakas came to Pennsylvania and visited Tom's grave, bowing deeply and whispering gratitude. Emily Mitchell and Kenji Tanaka started a foundation in 2029 dedicated to reconciliation and peace education, sharing their parents' story with students around the world. They spoke at schools and universities about the power of individual choice, about how one act of kindness can ripple through generations. They showed that photograph of 47 people and said, "This is what happens when you choose humanity. This is what happens when you refuse to hate. This is what happens when you remember that the person in front of you, no matter what uniform they wear, is someone's mother, someone's child, someone's hope for the future." They collected stories from other veterans, other survivors, other people who had chosen compassion in the middle of conflict. They created a database of reconciliation stories, proving that Tom and Akiko weren't unique, that humanity persists even in humanity's darkest moments. In 2030, a memorial was erected in Okinawa, at the site where the field hospital once stood. The land had been reclaimed by jungle after the war, but researchers used military records to pinpoint the exact location. They cleared the vegetation and built a simple stone monument, elegant and understated. It bears the names of Thomas Mitchell and Akiko Tanaka, and beneath their names a single sentence carved in English and Japanese. In the darkest night, one light is enough. The dedication ceremony was attended by veterans from both countries, old men and women who had once been enemies, who had once tried to kill each other, now standing together under the Okinawan sun. They were in their 90s and hundreds, the last generation that remembered the war firsthand, and they wept for the past and hoped for the future. They shared stories of their own moments of humanity, the times they chose mercy over vengeance, compassion over cruelty. An American veteran talked about sharing his water with a wounded Japanese soldier. A Japanese veteran talked about warning civilians before an attack. They proved that war doesn't have to define us, that we can be more than our worst moments, that redemption is always possible if we have the courage to face each other and say, "I see you, I forgive you, I thank you." The ceremony ended with a moment of silence, and in that silence you could almost hear the echoes of choices made 85 years ago, choices that still mattered, choices that would always matter. The story ends where it began, in a tent in Okinawa in April 1945, a young soldier making an impossible choice, a dying woman holding a photograph of her children, a moment of humanity in an inhuman time. Everything that came after, the reunion, the tears, the 47 lives, the foundation, the memorial, the documentary, the book, all of it started with one decision. Tom Mitchell could have walked away. He could have followed orders. He could have let hate win. But he didn't. He chose differently. And that choice echoed through 80 years across an ocean, through generations, proving what we all need to remember in these times when the world feels dark and hope feels impossible. We are not powerless. Our choices matter. Even in the darkest times, especially in the darkest times, we can choose to be human. We can choose to see each other. We can choose love over hate, compassion over cruelty, humanity over ideology. And that choice, that single choice made by one person in one moment, can change everything. It can save a life. It can create 47 lives. It can echo through time and prove that goodness is stronger than evil, that light is stronger than darkness, that one person really can make a difference. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that humanity persists even in our darkest moments, subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories of courage, compassion, and redemption. Hit that like button and leave a comment telling us about a time when someone's kindness changed your life, or a time when you chose compassion when hate would have been easier. These stories matter. Your story matters. We need to keep sharing them. Keep reminding each other that we are capable of extraordinary goodness, that our choices echo through time in ways we can never fully understand. Let's keep the light burning. Let's keep choosing humanity. Let's keep proving that love wins.